So in this presentation, I wanted to present on two things. One is an observation of what I think is a really significant problem, and the other part of this is to really put forward a proposal of a way in which we can actually overcome the problem. So I want to introduce this term of enclosure to describe what I think has been happening on the web since the emergence of social media, and why I think it's a bit of an issue that we really do need to overcome. So an enclosure is a term from the agricultural revolution, and it's used to describe the process that ended the ancient system of farming in open fields. Rather than individual farmlands that we have now, there was the commons, and everyone had a right to farm in the commons. An enclosure was the process of putting up fences on the commons and moving ownership of that property from the community into private hands. And this process generated massive social and economic change to the power dynamics, the social structures, and the levels of individual and community autonomy. It created new classes of people and an economic and social structure that really relied on exploitation. And in many ways, for me, I see this happening in today's digital networks. It's a case of history repeating itself. Because the original concept of the web was that we would all have our own websites, that we would have our own place to create and store and publish, and we would create a commons in which we could share knowledge. And through this digital network, a social space would emerge out of this big and open system. And the web was designed to be distributed, a network without a central point of failure or control. In this way, nodes could connect in a multitude of different ways. Networks would emerge in independent and evolving ways, able to be reshaped to suit the needs of the time. But today's digital networks are built on systems that look like this. They're centralized around a single database, a single point of failure, a single point of observation. A database able to be harnessed for commercial interests and effects. And while the number of nodes that these systems can support is truly amazing, they operate in isolation. A node in Facebook cannot connect to one in Twitter. A node in the LMS can't connect with LinkedIn. And this is regardless of whether that node is actually the same person or not. By simply using these systems, we're forced to create multiple identities. We've moved from a model where we essentially put our stuff into other people's containers. We've given up, it seems, on the open spaces, where once we shared, the fences have now been put up. Fences that keep our ability for us and our data to connect and be shared separate and contained. We put our photos on Flickr and our resume on LinkedIn, our personal lives on Facebook, our location on Foursquare. And from that point on, the data doesn't live in the commons. It doesn't even live in our own domain. It goes into these giant silos. We become renters of our own information. We become nodes, not in a network of our own, but in someone else's. And it's not just how we use these networks that encloses our data. These businesses actually have a variety of practices that they often exploit. So the acquisition of data, where the actual system of startups and venture capital actually promote a culture of build and then sell out. The strategy becomes around the accumulation of users and the associated data, which then becomes the asset that's used to leverage a buyout. We're often just faced with this binary choice. So the sign up to these networks is limited to really two options: accept or decline. There's no way to negotiate terms, understand them, or choose licensing options before you sign up. You really have to take everything at face value, and there's no room to actually negotiate any of these terms. There's also issues around licensing and the ownership of digital objects. When we sign up in those terms of service, quite often what we're doing is granting that company a perpetual license to use our data. It's not really granting them ownership, but in a digital sense rather than an analog world, what's the difference if they can access and use this information in any way that they seek useful for their own financial gain? And then there's the proprietary formats. By creating proprietary formats, our data becomes locked into their systems. And this means that there's little portability of our data. We can't move it between networks, we can't move it between software. It becomes anchored to a single system, which in many ways defeats the purpose of really being digital. Another way to think about this enclosure is outlined in the Hacker Manifesto that was written by Mackenzie Walk back in 2004. And it's important to note that this was really before the rise of social media. And in the book, Walk suggests that what was occurring was the rise of the vectorialist class, the owners of the vectors, the various pathways and networks over which information flows. In a nod to Marx, rather than owning the means of production, the vectorialists own and exploit the means of transmission. They may own the wires and the cables, but increasingly what they own are the platforms through which we consume and share. The vectorialists commodify information. They exploit information as a resource for capital. Our information, our data becomes the commodity through which they trade. We're really being exploited in order for them to make a profit. Our digital networks feed their commercial concerns. And perhaps the best example of how the vectorialist model isn't a theory, it's become reality, is this quote from Tom Goodwin, where now what we have is Uber, the world's largest taxi company, actually owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's most popular media owner, creates no content. And Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. What we're seeing here is power and money being shifted into those that can connect. And there's a significant amount of money invested here. These are the evaluations of these networks back in July. So our data and the networks that it travels through are incredibly valuable. And I think in many ways they're too valuable to be commodified in this way. Too valuable to be trusted in what is in essence younger, hipper fat cats who are really driven by a profit motive. But how do we avoid enclosure and stop the rise of the vectorialists? So this is just an idea that I've been working on the last probably 6 months to a year on really thinking through this and ways that we can kind of overcome this significant problem. So my proposition is that what we can do is empower the node, because the common element in any of these networks are the nodes, the individuals that make up the network. And I think it's really important to think of them as people, not as users. And people should have the right to be free and autonomous on the web, just as they are in life. So the solution is not in creating new networks or alternatives to Facebook or Twitter, as Mike suggested, getting away from the stream. What I think we need to do is think more about the garden. We need to move beyond the creation of networks as data containers, which can be commodified and commercialized. Instead, we need to focus on developing systems, tools, and methods that empower the node, ways that allow each node to establish control over their digital lives, to provide individuals the power to negotiate their networks and move seamlessly between them, to smash down the silos and the surveillance, to not just reclaim our domain, but to extend it with the ability to generate our own new networks. We need a new model, and that supports quite a different approach to social, economic, political, and technological issues in the digital space. And what's interesting is that there are a range of emerging technologies and practices that provide a glimpse into how this could actually happen. Concepts like federation, as in the federated wiki, APIs and the blockchain provide an insight into how all this could work. You may not understand what all of these things are, but understand that there are people in the tech world who are working at reshaping the available technologies. And it's something I'm interested in pursuing because I think it's an opportunity to actually reimagine the networks, how they're created, how they're governed, and for those of us at this conference, how they can be used to learn and to grow and to change. The idea that I've been fleshing out over the last 6 months or so is MyOS. It's a multi-purpose acronym that's kind of my way of attempting to actually encapsulate how this might work and how we could create it. So the first kind of concept here is that we want to be able to mind our own stuff. At its heart is the concept of the domain, and building on the work that Jim Groom and his team have been working on towards, what we need to do is start by having a space, a store and a server to do all this on. But the focus of MyOS is to think beyond our space. It's to look at how we might imagine connecting with each other, how we might create our own networks. Another way to think about it is to make your own space. What if we could actually reimagine Facebook, Twitter, and the LMS as spaces for networks rather than the containers of them? What would be possible then? What could we do if we could negotiate our own terms to move beyond the binary of accept or decline? parts of MyOS would be that it would be quite simple and easy to create our own networks without the need for this massive overhead of server infrastructure and centralized management. So my online self, I think this is really an important idea of really kind of building some form of identity into this. And as people, we're really multifaceted and we have different aspects to our lives. We take on different personas. We socialize with different groups. And I think we need technology that can actually support a better understanding of ourselves as complex human beings rather than data in a table. We need to be able to manage our identity online and not have it defined by LinkedIn or Facebook or Google. We shouldn't have to manage complex privacy settings that are open to change at any moment. We shouldn't have to fill in another online form so that our personal information can yet again be held in yet another database. I think we need to take control of ourselves and be able to define the way that we interface with these systems. And finally, there's this idea of my operating system. And I'm really kind of interested in what if we could make our online infrastructure and systems really as simple to run as your phone. And the way to do this, I think, is by developing a back-end structure that combines hardware and software so that you could add new features in much the same way that you install an app on your phone to give you specific functions. And I think we can add in a variety of different features. A way to manage your identity, your memberships, your personal records, to display badges and qualifications. You could share your publications, create galleries of information, develop a portfolio of your work, or collect notes. And that the systems that we interface could install their own applications, that if we want to integrate MyOS into our institutions, that the institution could actually develop an app that leverages our infrastructure in order to integrate with their system. So the idea here is really to create something that's adaptable to the individual and supportive of their own needs. So if you don't need these features, you don't install them. You don't have to work within a set of constraints. MyOS really embodies the following principle of Nodeware. And the way I've kind of defined this is that I think it's a combination of hardware and software that can change the underlying structure of systems from centralized to decentralized, from institutional to individual, from controlled to free, and from closed to open. And so MyOS really embodies some of the following principles. What I want to do is really bake these in from the outset. So the first one is that you are in control, that as a node you get to make the decisions. They're not made for you. That essentially the data is yours. Your data is sovereign and it should be treated that way. You should have authority over how your data is shared and used, who can access it, and for how long. Connections are negotiated. So rather than simply sign away to terms of service, we need to ensure democratic values are not lost. Networks require trust to work effectively. And so it's important that both sides are explicit about what and how they're willing to work. So there's a kind of negotiation and handshake that actually occurs when you're signing up to use a system through MyOS. And it's really about being able to define the ways things are going to work from now and going into the future. And essentially what this really is about is a way of enhancing and enabling diversity in technology. Rather than enforce a monoculture, MyOS aims to promote diversity. And we live in a complex world and we need a service that actually appreciates that complexity rather than limits it. And while there's a need for a stable core, MyOS should promote a more diverse ecosystem of applications. I think for those people that were gathered here today to discuss digital learning networks, then we acknowledge that they're incredibly useful and meaningful, but we must also accept that the networks that we currently use are limited because of the underlying models and technologies that supports them. These centralized structures actually hamper the way that they can be used and utilized. We need to change the model and change the mindset to become more distributed, to be more cooperative, to promote more autonomy, and ultimately to be more connected. To not just create new vectors, but to create a new commons. Thanks.